Welcome to another Apollo Papyrus podcast episode. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. For this episode, my interview guest, who has family connections to the book world, is the author of the thriller novel What Goes Around. His name is Michael Wendroff, and my interview with Michael will follow the note-taking sounds. Michael Wendroff, welcome to the Apollo Papyrus podcast.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Feel free to tell our listeners about your background, family connections to the book world, and authors you met when you were younger.
Sure. There's a lot there, but Michael Wendroff, and I am a global marketing consultant. I have my own firm, and now I'm proud to say that I am a debut author with my thriller called What Goes Around. It was published by Bloomsbury in the USA, UK, and Australia. It was published in hardcover. It's already been through 3 printings. Also published in ebook, and it's available in audiobook. And now it's coming out in trade paperback. And my agent has sold foreign language translation rights thus far in Japanese, in Hungarian, and in Italian. So it's gotten really good reviews, selling well. I'm very happy with it. And, in terms of family background, the impetus for this novel was actually something that my mother said to me the second I was born, or so I'm told. I was put on her chest. She looked deeply in my eyes and she said, "Oh, how nice to see you again." And it was that again part that always had me thinking, and I always wanted to do something with that. So that does play into the major twist ending in my novel. And she was actually an editor at New York City publishing houses back in the day. So, I distinctly remember her on a weekend sitting on a couch, cross-legged, red pen in hand, manuscript pages strewn about, marking up those pages with ink. And I think that prepared me for when I got my editor's input. It wasn't fun, but at least I was prepared based on seeing her editing earlier. And she actually remarried a literary agent. And I don't know if your listeners are fully aware, but literary agents are key in publishing today. An author cannot get a book sold unless he has an agent. And what an agent does is, an agent is actually, first of all, it's very hard to get an agent. It's almost harder to get a literary agent than it is harder to get published once you have an agent, I believe. But a literary agent will, so first people will send their manuscript ideas to them. And if he takes you on, and after looking at a sample of your writing and you're his client, he will review the book and make editorial suggestions even before he'll send it out to a publisher. What an agent will also do is agents know, what are the best editors at the different publishing houses for the type of book you're writing, your genre, in my case, a thriller. So they'll have connections and know who would be good to send you a particular book to. And then if you get an offer, they'll negotiate the offer. They'll go through the contracts with you, and then eventually sell other types of rights, whether they're foreign rights or film rights. So agents are key, and my mother remarried an agent back in the day as well. He was an agent to some, pretty famous authors, both thriller and mystery authors. And I guess that's how I got into those categories, because I used to read all the books of his clients, which I got for free, of course. And I just loved that. And I learned, what makes a good thriller, what makes a good mystery from that experience. And in fact, one of his clients was Robert Ludlum, who's people may know more readily these days from his Bourne Identity movies with Matt Damon, but he was a best-selling author. And I remember one time we got invited to stay over at his winter home, which was in St. Thomas in the Caribbean. And I remember waking up very early one morning and, sneaking up to where he was in his living room, and he was there sitting on a couch with a yellow legal pad and a number 2 pencil in hand, scribbling away. And that is how he wrote his 450-page novels, by hand, which is, I admired Ludlum's plotting and his prose, But thank God when it came time to write my novel, I could do it on a PC and not by hand the way he did. So there's a bit about me for you.
I have some questions about your thriller novel, but before I ask those questions, was it true that your Master's of Business Administration or MBA thesis was excerpted by Publishers Weekly magazine? And if so, what was it like to find that part of your thesis was in an issue of Publishers Weekly?
I tell you that was pretty amazing, and it was I'd always wanted to write, but I went to business school at NYU, and I went undergraduate business school, and then I went for my MBA degree, and it was with that degree, that thesis, that I really married my love of books and the publishing industry with my newfound love of marketing, because my thesis title was Marketing in the Publishing Industry. And so I started to, go around and interview publishing executives, and the industry trade journal got wind of that, and they spoke to me. And once it was all over, they looked it over and said, "Hey, this is really cool. This would be important to our readership, which is basically the publishing world." And they excerpted it in three consecutive issues, and they paid me for it, and that was the first time I got paid for writing, and I liked that. I definitely liked that. But the other thing I liked about that experience was I remember one time I was waiting to interview the editor in chief at Simon and Schuster, at the time a gentleman by the name of Michael Korda, and I was waiting outside his office, and it had come way overtime for our scheduled interview, and finally. The door opens to his office, and he sees me, and he ushers me forward, and he says, "Oh, I want you to meet someone." And it was none other than Truman Capote of In Cold Blood fame. I mean, talk about a great thriller. So, and Truman Capote looked exactly as you would imagine, very, very dapper. So that was a fun part of that whole experience as well.
Without spoiling too much about your thriller novel, What Goes Around, and you kind of touched on it a bit already in this interview, but what is it about?
Well, it is a thriller that is about some mysterious killings that are going on in a small town. To help investigate them, two detectives who hate each other, one man and one woman, are assigned to the case, and they've got to try and figure out who the killer is, what's going on before they kill each other. And their journey takes them into some topical and secret worlds of groups like incels and boogaloo boys and supremacists. And the book goes through a lot of twists and turns, and until finally it has the major twist at the end, which harkens back to what my mother said to me the second I was born. But at its essence, it's a story of life and love and learning, and really transcending the bounds of life and death.
Although your novel is a work of fiction, were parts of What Goes Around based on real life events?
Yeah, it really was. I mean, when I decided to, I always wanted to write a thriller, and it was really COVID which got me to do it, because as it has for many writers, I've learned, in that there's one point during COVID-19 pandemic that you couldn't do anything. I mean, in my town, you couldn't go to the beach, I couldn't play tennis, and certainly we couldn't go to the movies or restaurants and all that. So basically, I had no more excuses. So I sat down and I wrote the novel. And when I'm thinking up the plot, step one, ideation, I said, well, I want it to be thrilling. I want it to be real page turner, but I also wanted to have it to be topical. And at the time, I just couldn't understand the real world events that happened in Charlottesville, Virginia, with the Unite the Right March. So I did a lot of research into that whole thing, and then came across these crazy groups like these Boogaloo Boys and these incels. So I learned a lot about them, and I wanted to write about, what would happen if, some naive young teenager all of a sudden got swept up in that. Those were some true events that I wrote about, and a lot of the specific details of things like how certain shootings occur and how certain things are investigated, and as well as some other well-known figures in it, or we're all based on true things that I've fictionalized a bit, but a lot of it is really based on the truth. And you know, in my writing process, it involves a lot of research, and these days the good thing is there is Chat GPT, but you got to be careful. You got to double check what it says. Back when I wrote this novel, it was a lot of Googling various articles, and ChatGPT or AI is more efficient. But what I found the best type of research to do is to actually talk to the people who are involved in who are like the characters in your novel. So I was lucky. I was able to reach out to my local police station, and I asked if there was a female detective there, and luckily there was, and she was terrific, giving me all sorts of insight and stories that a lot of which I used in the novel. And I met with a chief of police in another place, and I met with a FBI agent. So I met with a lot of these real people who gave me a lot of insights. And then so it is key to do your research that way. Now, I don't think I spoke to any serial killers.
What was the editorial process for what goes around? Like, because I understand that was quite involved, actually.
Well, there's two parts to it, I guess. I mean, the first would be, my own editorial process. And what that is for me is, after, once I know what the whole plot is going to be, and I sit down to write, I will, get up early. I write best early in the morning, and I'll just get the story out, get on the PC and get the words going, and don't even care about, certainly not spelling or grammar, but don't even care so much about the sentences themselves. Just get the story flowing. And then the next morning, say it's day 2, I'll go back and I'll reread what I had scribbled out the day before. And that's when I try and make it into real writing. Look at every word, make sure all the words work perfectly with the other words in the sentence, make sure all the sentences work with the others in the paragraph, add the analogies, add the metaphors, do all of that stuff. And once I feel that I've polished what I'd written the day before, then I will be scribbling out the next part of the story, and not worrying so much about the words. And that will be the process every day, scribble out, refine, scribble out, etc. And I'll do that every day until, finally I could write my favorite 2 words, which are the end. But to your point on the editorial process, writing the end, authors have to know that certainly is not the end, because, once Bloomsbury purchased my book from me, I found out that there's all sorts of editorial stages. So, for example, the first stage was the editor that bought the book. That editor is what I'd say is more of a structural or a strategic editor, dealing with just very big, broad issues, I would say. Maybe you need a prologue, or maybe move this part from the middle of the book to earlier in the book, that type of thing, very broad. And then after that, there comes the line editor, whose job really is to make sure that, every line in your book is as good as it can be. And then after that, you have the copy editor, who's checking things like, dates, make sure you didn't change things that didn't make sense, or make sure you didn't say, she has green eyes in chapter 2 and blue eyes in chapter 4, that kind of thing. And then, there's the proofing process as well. And, every time I go through each of those rounds of editing, I've got to, reread my book again. And I finally thought I was finished. And my publisher says to me, okay, they've just set the typeface on your hardcover edition. You got to read that through to make sure some type didn't fall out in this process. I can't tell you how many times I read my book. It's a good thing I like it.
From start to finish, how long did it take you to write your novel?
I would say, well, for myself, so before the publisher bought it, I would say it was about a year and a half. And and yeah, we've gone through no, I can tell you a little bit more about my process. So there's two types of writers. There are pantsers and there are plotters. And that both styles do result in best-selling novels. So one isn't any better than the first. A pantser I admire. I couldn't do that, but they have no plot in mind when they sit down, or they maybe just have a very general idea of what they're going to do, and they get on their laptop and every day they write, and they just write by the seat of their pants. That's why it's called a pantser. And then there are the plotters, which is like me. And plotters, especially me, I need to have a very detailed outline of where I'm going with it. First step, of course, is ideation, come up with the storyline, but then I plot things out pretty carefully. And of course, it's not like things don't evolve; they do. And sometimes for strange reasons. I remember one time where my plot called for one of my characters to be killed, and along the process of writing, I got to really like this character, and I couldn't do it, so couldn't kill him, so I had to change my plot and do something else. And in fact, there was another time when I had another character that I really liked a lot, also was supposed to be killed off. And this one I did kill off. I had no other way to get around it in the plot. And then my wife, I'm moping around the house for a week, and she says, "What's wrong with you? You've been depressed all week. These characters aren't real." But to an author, they are real. You get to know them pretty well.
What goes around is traditionally published, but I want to talk about the process of getting a literary agent for you. What was that like?
That's a really difficult process, and you do need an agent these days, or publishers will not look at your book. Agents are important in the screening process, and basically I mean, there are resources out there. There are books of literary agents or online places where they list agents. And what you've got to do is you've got to make sure that go through that list and find the ones that represent the type of books you write. So don't send a thriller to an agent that loves romances, that type of thing. Sometimes, one trick in how to find a good agent might be to go to the bookstore and pick up some of the books that are, good selling books in your category, and look at the acknowledgement page, and they'll usually acknowledge their agent. That's where you can find out exactly who's agenting who. And the more the better off you are, because what you have to do is what's called a query letter. And that query letter, it will differ from agent to agent as to what they want, but basically it's a quick note that says what's special about your book and what's special about you. And some agents will want a little sampling of your work and take it from there. But don't be surprised if you have to send out 100 to get one, but all it takes is one.
Now, you wrote What Goes Around in English, but your book has been translated into Japanese, Hungarian, and Italian. What is the process of selling foreign language translation rights for a traditionally published novel like?
So that is really in the purview of your agent, of your literary agent. So he's the one that goes out and, has connections in different countries. And again, he might have what's called a sub-agent in another country that he'll work with. And that sub-agent knows all of the individual publishers and editors and who would be the best one for your book, similar to the US process. So they will go ahead once the sale is made, I'm not involved in the translation, thankfully. And it was interesting for me because the first one that came out was the Hungarian edition. It came out recently, and they changed the cover, which I didn't actually expect that, although I guess I should have. I love my cover in the US. It looks like a thriller. It stands out on the shelf, and it kind of, once you know what the book's about, it thematically has a design that works with the whole idea of the book. But the Hungarian publisher changed it, and I like it a lot. It's different, but I like it. So I like both. But these publishers will do what they want in terms of catering to what they feel their specific audience will respond to. So that was interesting for me. And then of course the name "What Goes Around" is something that they have to translate as well. And interestingly, the other countries do have expressions similar to the "what goes around comes around" expression. So it's not exact word for word, but the idea is there. And the "what goes around" name that I have on my thriller, interestingly, was not what I had come up with. It wasn't my original choice. Um, the publisher had come to me and said that, hey, we think for a thriller we could do a better than what you're thinking, and they gave me like six choices, and I picked that one, and that was their favorite too. So it was so it's a group effort in a lot of ways on a lot of things. And in terms of the other publications, I have not seen the Italian yet. I heard it's going to be out soon, so I should be seeing that imminently. And the Japanese, I think they're having it launch during the Christmas period.
One final question to finish this interview. You mentioned early in the interview that you had an association with the late, great Robert Ludlum, and you once vacationed at his home. What was that experience like?
He was a great guy, and he had this home on top of a hill in St. Thomas, and he was very gracious. He took us out to a lot of dinners, and he didn't mind me sitting there while he was writing away with his pen and rather his pencil on his yellow legal pad. So he was a great guy. I mean, he did die a little mysteriously too, which was interesting for a thriller writer. But it was really good that I was early on. I got to meet a bunch of different authors because of my stepfather being a literary agent. And, it was interesting too, in that when my agent was peddling my book, my stepfather, who'd been an agent, was very ill. And in fact, when I finished during that process, my stepfather Henry, he died, and the day after he died, my book was sold. So I think I had a little help from above, and it will be good to see him and my mother, who's also passed on, again.
Michael, you were a very insightful guest, and I thank you for appearing on the Apollo Papyrus podcast.
Thank you. This was great.
It was fascinating to interview Michael. What Goes Around is available through Kindle Unlimited for subscribers to that service, and as a Kindle Unlimited subscriber myself, I hope to read Michael's book soon. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to find your writing and reading purpose. Bye for now. Copyright 2025, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this podcast episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.